Body language in meetings. While you enter the room, you must walk tall. We see what this gentleman does when he enters the room and the kind of impression he leaves on the members in the boardroom. You must greet the members there. Stand tall and take up space. Widen your stance. You must strike a power pose which shows the sense of authority you project. Choose the seat appropriately. Sit up straight. Your hands should be properly placed and weight should be even on both the legs. Maintain eye contact with the members. Show gestures which denote the sense of interaction between the person chairing the session and the members in the boardroom. It also shows that each and every member is receptive enough to take in ideas and to give inputs. What you must not do in a meeting is you must not intrude the personal space of the member. You must have gap in between while you are speaking to the member in the boardroom. You must not lean back in one's chair. Your legs should not be crossed. Hunching back with hands denote improper body language in a meeting. One must not do that as it shows inappropriate body language. You must not cross arms. That shows that you're not open to take up ideas and you're rigid. You must not shift around in the chair that you're sitting. When you have a fidgeting body language, that actually shows that your interest is elsewhere and not in the agenda of the meeting.
Good evening, everyone. We are here to discuss a very important agenda that has been brought forward to our notice after we have evaluated certain media reports in campus. As per a report from Scholars Avenue, the on-campus English newspaper of IIT Kharagpur, we have seen that a number of discrepancies have come forward with regard to the election procedure that occurs within IIT Kharagpur for the Gymkhana. The four issues that were primarily pointed out were the system of voter identification, the nature of candidate credentials and how they are vetted, the format of candidate evaluation in general, and the minimum cutoffs imposed based on what credentials exist for each candidate. So before we set the agenda and announce the positions from each side of this house, let's just introduce ourselves. My name is Ankit. I'm going to be chairing this meeting. On this side, we have Partha Kadambi and Chandra Siddharth. They are representing the Institute Administration. And on this side, we have Manav Garg, Subhajit Chaudhary, and Rohit Roy, who are representing individual halls of residence and therefore effectively the student community of IIT Kharagpur. So let's begin. We'll start our discussion by talking about the nature of voter identification and how that identification is evaluated or checked during the election system itself. So considering that the Institute Administration wants to begin by informing changes into the system, let's begin with you and let's see what your perspective is on this entire issue.
Right, so I think at each polling center, I think it's very important to ensure that we have one person from the administration itself checking for the identity of the person who's voting at all points of time. I think you can just have a roster system, and this has to be done across all polling centers. For ease of general ease of voting, I think we should have probably 3 or 4 centers and spread the responsibility across like 3-4 representatives from the institute. I think student representatives should not be the ones ultimately checking for the identities. And if it's necessary, I think we should put forward a biometric system as well too. Sure.
As I would like to put forward another suggestion, as we've seen in the past that we've had issues with people the issues that voter ID fraud has been happening, coming out in the media, coming out in articles of our media body. We think it is very important for the image of our institution that these discrepancies don't happen, and it is very much within our vision for what we have to ensure that the elections happen in a fair and proper.
So under this context, the idea is basically that considering that elections currently happen within the individual 20 halls of residence within campus, you are advocating for a more centralized system where within a specific smaller number of centers, everybody votes, and that voting system is evaluated by institute administration officials.
Yeah.
But in contrary, I think Mana would have something to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, we think it is a very valid concern that has come out in the last 1 or 2 years, and as the student body, we are absolutely against any activities which are against the principles of free and fair election. Before we put forward our side of the issue, we think it is also important to rein in campus media bodies like the Scholars Avenue because of what Sir said in terms of the effect of the publicity that these campus bodies have. We think elections are very intrinsic and very close to our campus, and we should not let these reports go out. But sir, what we are worried about is understanding why is it that these incidents happen, because we don't know why it happened. So unless somebody can highlight why voter fraud was allowed to happen, we cannot solve this problem itself. Because as of now, changing the place where people get to vote seems to be a little too much effort. Because students typically vote because it's very close to their room, like right inside the mess or inside the common room. So they can vote very easily. We are worried about making it really tough for students to get a chance to vote.
But you're not against the principle of voter fraud like being a bad issue.
I mean, if I could add on to that, I think our main concern is in this regard, yes, that we need to solve the issue, but just going on the face of it and implementing rules without analyzing where the source, where the root of this problem is something that we think we need to realize and definitely go ahead with. So our primary objective in this regard is to analyze this further, but at the same time not take the drastic step of just centralizing the election system, because we think voter turnouts in itself will reduce when people will now have to go like further distances to departments which are sometimes a very far distance away from the halls, specifically the ones which are further away from the department.
Also, if the person who is being elected is for the post of a vice president or a general secretary sports, we think that it is most important that he's represented, or the voting is representative of as many people and as inclusive as possible. We think that if the turnout is less, it may cause the wrong candidate to be elected in something like this.
So considering that all of you agree to the fact that voter fraud exists and is a problem, and since you have pointed out that not understanding the source of voter fraud is a problem and therefore their move is short-sighted in that regard, can you evaluate what you think are the reasons why voter fraud does exist in the first place, and therefore from that perspective they can also then re-engage and tell you how their model would then fit within that problem in the first place?
So we think it's just a problem of slight complacency. We think just ensuring that voting procedures are made as stringent as possible, as Sir said, in terms of more oversight, in terms of more representative from administration, etc. We think that in itself should solve this problem. We don't think it is as big a problem that needs the election procedure to be shifted out of the residential part of the campus to like the administrative or the academic, etc.
What do you have to say on that?
Right, so it's not so much of a question as to shifting the voting or polling centers out of the halls themselves. I think most of the halls are quite close together, so I don't think at any point of time it's going to really hamper the students' ability to really come out and like go to a common area. Let's just say inside the pan roof you have a centralized area where everyone can come out. And two, it's not as if all the students of the hall are present in the hall all the time. It's like probably 20 to 30% of the total capacity is present in the hall at any one point of time. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a reasonable claim to assert that the numbers are going to like reduce, the voter turnout numbers are going to reduce to a point where it's going to drastically change the outcome of the election even. And, and the primary point is that when we have common areas of oversight, we ensure that it's a clearer, transparent picture of what the election process is going like. We think the more number of polling centers we have, the more chances there is for any sort of oversight to happen. There's more transparency. We think with linear and clear box systems.
But then don't you think that with greater centralization and therefore more people coming to a single polling center, it's actually more difficult to implement transparency?
Just if I might just add, like realistically, like elections happen in the month of April and mid-April, and it is excruciating weather outside. So even at times, just having to move outside from your hall and walk 20 meters and stand in the sun to cast a vote could often be too much of a burden.
Also, the fact that the voting happens just 2 weeks or 1 week before the end semester examinations of the students are held, and therefore a lot of students would be desensitized to go and vote in a scenario where there is a huge line to just cast one vote.
Also, I think adding to that, when the representatives here were talking about how most of the students might not be in the hall, we think we specifically reserve a certain day when we know that all other academic activities have been halted, hence that most students will be present in their hall, solely to ensure that we can have as many of our student body members, as many of our students vote in the elections in and of itself. So I do think that some of the concerns that we have raised with regards to how this is going to disincentivize people to go, and how more importantly this is going to reduce the voter base and then affect the results of the election, do still hold, and is something that we should.
So since there's common ground with the idea that there's need for more oversight, why would it not be a reasonable issue? What is the problem with the administration from increasing oversight within the various halls of residence in the existing system, but just increasing oversight within those various halls of residence?
I think it's just a logistical problem. The number of officials we need to set aside to like oversee polling in like let's say 20 different halls is simply not, we can't provide for those resources within our institute. And I think the lesser number of people, like really the more you centralize a certain process, the more oversight you have over it in general.
But would you favor oversight over loss of vote share in and of itself?
Yes, we don't.
Let he may speak. No?
Yeah, so we would think we would need to come to a consensus with the student body, because we would like to keep good relations with them in the longer run. And we think that it is not a question of oversight versus centralization, it's a question of what trade-off are we willing to make. And we would like to come to a consensus on this.
Sure, so now that we've come to a reasonable understanding of what the issue is in general, let's move on to the second aspect of the issue that has been put forward. Let's talk about the SOP, or the Statement of Purpose system, and how those are evaluated by the public in general. For a bit of context for those who don't know, the SOP system in IIT Kharagpur involves all the candidates appearing on a public platform, and where each individual candidate puts forward their own credentials for why they believe they should be elected by the student body in general, and more importantly are evaluated and questioned on their credentials and their proposals for the student community by a pre-selected panel of students. This panel of students includes one individual student representing each hall of residence in campus, and often those halls of residence representatives within those panels are the only people who are able to ask any questions with this process at all. Therefore, the questioning process is, very importantly, not open to the general body in particular. So with that kind of system, a lot of issues have been pointed out by the media bodies with respect to how this is often a system which allows cronyism to exist within the panels, and how to a large extent candidates are often not effectively tested on questions that the student body may actually have for those candidates in the first place. So again, since you are from the administration, since you wish to change that particular status, why do you think that should be changed? Why should the current system be changed in favor of something that you would have in mind?
Right, so we are not against the idea of having a SOP which is largely decentralized towards the student body. But at the same time, we want a few, at least, institute representatives to be present, in the SOP itself, and secondly, have some degree of oversight into who exactly the panel is composed of.
More on that idea, I think, so the importance of a vice president of the technology students gymkhana in an institute like IIT Kharagpur is that he's not just the face of the student body, he's the face of the institution as well. So we think and it's very important for us as the administration to make sure that he's thoroughly vetted and he's thoroughly examined and made sure that he's capable of discharging his duties as the vice president. And we think the current system that is in place is necessarily an impediment to us going ahead and examining him to our fullest
So
potential.
from that perspective, you would propose an alternative model. Let's look at alternative models that do exist, let's say for the model that exists in IIT Madras, which is probably the most closely associated in terms of having distinct halls of residence and having a system of elections for their own gymkhana or the Students' Activity Center in that particular institute. There, unlike our own institute where we have a public panel-based evaluation of candidates, we have individual candidates coming on stage, having PPT presentations for their proposals as well as their credentials as well. And more importantly, the questioning is open to the general public as well. Of course, as any system exists, it will have its own advantages and disadvantages. In comparison, we say, suppose we are discussing these two alternative models between our current model and say IIT Madras's model, why would you think our current model is better off?
So I think one of the problems, and this again originates from the source of this discussion, is elitism that exists within campus. We think much like the media body that has like highlighted these problems, or the kind of like system that has PPTs and a lot of like speech making, etc. We just think elections are about finding the best administrative talent. And we think that's something that the Gymkhana constitution also enshrines. We've agreed that, and that's the reason why we don't have a CGPA cutoff of 8.5, or we don't need them to have like a lot of experience in the past. We are looking for people that who the student community believes are the best at representing their interest in the administrative front. So on that, we think the moment we shift to a system that involves a lot of public speaking, a lot of like demonstration of that talent, we think the kind of candidates that we will then get are candidates who are not necessarily the best representatives. And that is something that we are very worried about.
To add on to that, a few things that we think our current system of SOPs where we have a selected panel, we think there are a few benefits that do come out, right? So because there are conflicting candidates and their respective panelists which are from say the halls that would not support these candidates, we think it sort of increases the amount of pressure that the panel puts, the kind of the difficulty of the questions that are asked to these candidates, which we think in a normal public forum, for instance, would not come out to begin with. I think in and of itself that is a better model to have than having say going with the model that was proposed in terms of what happens in IIT Madras, because I think in terms of just sheer administrative capabilities, candidates are like have to present their actual talents and have to defend their stances in a much more pressurized environment, which is I think a benefit.
Sure, but in the case where they do advocate for the fact that directly students do have a right to represent themselves and their voices directly to the candidates who will ultimately represent the institute as well, it's not as if your concerns are unfounded with respect to the alternative that they are founding, but is there also not a possibility of contributing to that model by, say, for example, including the media in the entire process? I understand that you have particular issues with the media existing within the campus in and of itself, but from that perspective, what do you think about addition of, say, the use of social media within the use of the elections itself, or the inclusion of media more formally within the process of electoral conduct?
So maybe we were wondering if a lot of these changes could start off as non-mandatory. So in terms of the administration and Gymkhana and us as people who represent halls residents, encouraging more candidates to subject themselves to media interviews or AMAs or something of that sort, while not making it mandatory, and hoping that we do it as a positive, like as an incentive instead of having to force people to do it. Would that be something that the administration would be reasonably happy with?
Yeah, I think apart from the general vetting, the SOPs here, we would like each of the candidates to have a separate set of interviews with institute administration, a few prominent figures, separate interview process. We could make this completely transparent. We would be open to releasing these tapes, but they would definitely have to go through this alternative process as well, to ensure the institute has a say in like what sort of candidates stand for the election and whether or not they are fit to represent the institute. Because after all, they're not only representing student concerns in the institute, they're also representing our institute, as we have often seen. the VP and senior posts in the institute, or student posts in the institute, often get a lot of media coverage and get to interact with a lot of prominent personalities. So we think it's really important to have this.
More on that idea, we also think that the public speaking or presenting yourself in a very impressive manner is something that is very important for VPs or vice presidents in general, because they are our representatives outside public forums. We send the vice presidents to interact on behalf of the institute, on behalf of the student community of the institute. We think public speaking is just as good as administrative skills in that regard.
If I could add on to that, it is not like the current candidates themselves aren't good public speakers. When Manav was talking about how there will be a shift when you start making presentations, for instance, is that currently we don't expect our VP candidates to be outstanding or stellar public speakers, or more importantly to be judged solely or primarily on the basis of their public speaking. So we think as long as, so for instance, if these VP candidates were not good enough public speakers, we think they would be not very persuasive in the SOPs, because at the end of the day, the SOP is where you have to speak out your opinion and you have to defend your stance, right? In and of itself, just there when the panelists question.
If I may add, also the groundwork in the election. So today we are spending most of our time trying to find out what is the best proposal, and conducting interviews with administration or other students, and trying, like, our focus is on coming up with a proposal that is most effective or that is most needed, which will then change to like whatever our proposal, let's get done with the proposal really quickly, and then let's make the best PPT, or let's make the best, like, showmanship will then start taking the center stage.
So I think we've all generally agreed to the idea that there's a need to reevaluate the procedures, and while there exists that kind of consensus, there's still perhaps a need to understand that possibly forcing such consensus down the throat of the student representatives is probably not the best action, especially considering both sides do recognize that this is a decentralized process that ultimately does stand with ultimate power to the institute. Having evaluated this, let's go to the final and probably most contentious argument in this agenda, which is the idea of minimum credentials existing for various criteria to evaluate the students in the first place. This is something that has currently been very controversial, because the administration specifically had tried to increase the CGPA cutoff for nominatable candidates within the institute to 7, which was previously 6.75. From the perspective of the administration, what are your arguments to advocate that there be certain floor limits to ensure that below this floor, certain students just cannot participate in the election process?
Yes, so we think on behalf of the administration that, as we said before, the vice president is not just a candidate who represents the student community within our campus, right? We think this person, when he goes ahead and does a bad job in his academics, which is primarily an academic institution, it is the Indian Institute of Technology after all. We think when he goes ahead and does a bad job in his academics, or comes off with a backlog or something like that later, we think it reflects very badly on the kind of institutional capabilities that we have when somebody as important as the vice president goes ahead. So we think that such a floor on the CGPA, maintaining it at a considerably higher level, ensures that these kind of problems don't occur, and hence the public image of our institution doesn't go down. We also try to be inclusive of the fact that administration or past administrative experiences does take up a lot of your time, and hence we don't advocate or push for these students to be the best of the best among the students that we have. We think that that is why we want to have a considerable consensus to raise it to an extent so that these problems don't occur, but not impede on the functionality of these people in improving their administration.
In contention to that, we think that the CGPA is kind of an arbitrary metric, in the sense that you can't really demarcate the difference between someone who has a 6.75 and a 7, especially when you want these people to be a role model. I think their extracurriculars, or the fact that they might have done well, which is in some field which is not exactly their academic accomplishment, is also something which the CGPA does not take into account. And in this regard, it's a bit arbitrary to say that they can't make for good role models.
Also, to add on to that, if I may, we think in general their concern is that there might be poor students who would probably have like poor CGPAs and not be academically good enough, and that will look bad on the institute. I think from the student body we agree that that is true, which is why we don't see a lot of candidates with very low CGPAs or like having a lot of backlogs get elected in the first place, because not only will it look bad on the institute if he gets elected, but when he's contesting for elections it will look bad on him as well, right? Because these are things that are also discussed in your SOP. We think there's a self-check mechanism that exists in our current election procedure that automatically kicks out like candidates who aren't at the very least at the minimum level that we require. We do have a problem when the administration is going to enforce this on people, because we think a lot of very good possible VP candidates will probably just not be able to make it because we've drawn an arbitrary line somewhere.
Additionally, with what Rohit said, also the administration does have some role already in terms of faculty advisors having to sign off on candidates. So while we agree with the general idea that we don't think a vice president should ever have a very bad academic record, but what Shubhaji said was that you could be a good student because of, let's say, other compensating factors. So we think it's fine for faculty advisors to then decide that if somebody has a low GPA, but let's say has done a very good job as the department representative or something like that, and if that student can manage, let's say, academics and the post together, and therefore the faculty advisor, who's probably the most crucial interface between the student and the like academic administrative body, can then take maybe like a subjective call on a student again, like whether they think the student is fit enough or not.
So on that basis, I think we all agree at this point that while academics is certainly important, perhaps the way that academics is being evaluated for the perspective of the particular candidates contesting is, while certainly under some amount of contention, still comes to a consensus that even if it's self-checking or whether it's imposed by the administration as a new rule, it's automatically inclined to go higher and higher, and therefore the academics automatically gets involved within the entire system itself. This was a very fruitful discussion. I thank all the participants for participating and contributing so significantly to a very important agenda of the institution. With that, we'd like to close this discussion. Thank you.